Bro, there's literally scientific studies that show that a child who is beaten or is taking physical damage from a family member takes that into their adulthood. You said that before.
Yeah.
Is it like a factor
But taking it into your adulthood, like how we define trauma in this day and age, since you want to be Gen Z so much, even though you're a millennial. Hello, my name is Ben Urbano. Welcome to Think Twice, YouTube's favourite philosophy show. And I'm joined here by my co-host today, Sam Tefra.
Well, go on.
And if you listen to our show or you watch our show, you would understand what the premise of the show is about. The premise of the show is about we find an ideology and we find our positions on the ideology, basically. Right? That's
pretty much what we do.
And this one in particular, always remember something like, my dad used to tell me this. He used to say, he'd tell you to do something, and if you don't do it, he would say, if you don't hear, you must feel. You know? Some people don't get that. Some people don't understand that.
That sounds a little bit traumatizing, bro.
It's not. How can you tell me about my trauma? You're projecting. We're not gonna go into
hold on, but you just admitted it's trauma.
I didn't admit it's trauma.
You just said, how can you tell me about my trauma?
Yeah, but in the sense that how can you tell me about what is my trauma?
Okay, good save.
That's not a save. That's not a save. That's not a save.
Sorry, I'm interrupted.
Yeah, no, it's cool, man. I can't even get through my first segment, opening monologue.
I'm sorry.
You know that Shannon and Skip? I can't even get through my opening monologue.
I don't want to feel. Let me hear.
Anyway, our opinions on violence vary, and they generally depend on how you were raised, and our personalities are developed at such a young age that our relationship and our sort of interaction with violence and conflict then leads us onto how we interact and how we develop our relationship with conflict as we grow older.
Absolutely.
So today I thought we should discuss pacifism. And I have to start most shows explaining what the ideology is because it only makes sense to, otherwise we're gonna end up going through the whole show or you're gonna stop listening, right? So pacifism is basically the belief that war or violence are unjustifiable and that all disputes should be settled by peaceful means. You'll probably know where I'm going to stand on that one. It won't be a huge surprise to people. Where I'm going to stand on that one, given what I do for a living. But that's what we're going to discuss today. And the first question is pacifism a viable approach to resolving conflicts?
I absolutely think it is.
Fuck no, you don't.
Yes, I do. Yeah. I think it's one of the options that's available to you when faced with a conflict. So especially when you have an interpersonal...
If you're going to change the question, then you can answer it that way, but...
No, but you said, is it a viable approach? It is viable to a point. There's a point at which it's no longer viable, but I think it's definitely viable, especially in individual interpersonal conflict. So if you have a conflict with your colleague, sibling, family member, friend, I definitely think those conflicts can be resolved with non-violent means. What do you think?
I don't think it's a viable approach to resolving conflict.
So you don't think it's viable in any sense of the word? So if someone just slapped me, I think I can resolve that non-violently.
Of course, but there is a slight difference between non-violence and pacifism.
Sure.
Pacifism is to suggest that violence is not on the table.
Yeah.
Whilst if someone slaps you, you're able to speak to them and say, why did you slap? And you're able to have a conversation. But you are always ready for violence.
Yeah. But I think generally my starting point is that I don't want to engage in violence. I might not go as far as pacifism. I hear what you're saying. But definitely violence is something to be avoided for me in conflict. Especially when I'm having an interpersonal conflict. If you're having conflict with an oppressor of an entire group, race, political party, I think your options are limited and you might have to employ violence in a way that you don't have to when you're doing an individual relationship type conflict.
Yeah, I completely hear you. But while I was thinking about this, I just thought the idea or the premise of violence is really important in conflict. Mm-hmm. The threat of violence is truly important. I was doing some reading and I came across like the theory of deterrence, basically, which is basically the idea that if at any point in a conflict someone else will retaliate, their actions will be less aggressive, essentially. And that theory, you sort of see it in your day-to-day. You sort of see it when you're driving or when someone's walking. The difference between the reason why you don't get walk rage or pavement rage or whatever they might
But you get road rage.
but you get road rage is because the likelihood of violence and conflict in the car is a lot less. That someone's going to step out their car and you're going to get into a physical altercation with that person.
Right.
Whilst,
Whereas
like,
on the
walking,
pavement, you're face to face with someone.
you're likely to get into that altercation. Therefore, you're more amicable and that interaction is often a lot more polite.
I hear that, but like, I think when you frame the conflict in terms of like who's ready to do violence or like violence is on the table and there's a like threat of violence in the air, don't you think that creates a little bit of a vibe in your interactions with people? And like whoever's most ready to do violence, whoever's like more capable to do violence has the bigger threat and therefore can dominate the situation.
Yeah, that can happen.
Right.
But I think
But surely that's not really how we want to conduct society. Like the biggest, baddest guy walking on the pavement is just going to get his way because he's got more capacity to do violence.
No, but like we have to understand that like there can be a retaliation. And the other person doesn't know the consequences of their actions. And that's the idea. You don't know how powerful or how strong the other person you're interacting with may be.
Sure, but like if I'm like trained in jiu-jitsu or something, I'm basically like a fighter and I'm a professional fighter, I think it's fair that most people walking on the street can't do shit to me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So I'm the biggest, baddest guy on this pavement. So I'm not necessarily worried about this person's retaliation, but they definitely should be worried about my retaliation. So they're just going to concede. They're just going to be like, actually, nah. Like what I'm saying is probably not that deep.
I don't believe that to be true though. Because where you've got to makes sense if we accept that the idea that the person who is bigger, badder in this scenario is likely to do more damage. If we accept that, then yeah, that's the outcome. But I don't accept that that's what they want to do.
I'm not saying that's what they want to do, but you started at the top by talking about like the threat of violence being important in a confrontation, basically. Like you understand that person could do something to you and you could do something to them. I'm saying that surely when one person can do so much more, there's an imbalance there. And just in society, the people who can do the most and have less to fear, they're just going to run society.
No, but what you're saying is the reason, I think what you're missing is you don't know what the other person can do. And by not knowing that means you conduct yourself amicably.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is if someone is trained in martial arts.
Yeah, but what if someone has a gun? This is what I mean. Like,
this is a race to the bottom. This is a race to like who can do the most damage. Like
No. It's the fact that damage can be done. Therefore, I conduct myself as amicably as possible in order to make sure the situation is resolved without violence.
Okay, but like let's take the jiu-jitsu guy. He comes up against a 12-year-old child. They have a conflict in some general sense. The kid wants something, the guy wants to do something else, and they're engaged in some sort of trivial conflict. Does that guy who's trained in jiu-jitsu have a reasonable assumption that the 12-year-old can do that him damage? I don't think he can.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The 12-year-old can't do shit to him.
Yeah.
And I think you could upgrade that 12-year-old to like a teenager, a young adult, a woman, someone who's disabled. You know what I mean? It's just like the guy who's trained in jiu-jitsu is going to overpower these people in basically 99% of all circumstances. So he doesn't need to think about, oh, what if they do me something?
Yeah, but
let's go to America.
If we take extreme examples.
Why is that an extreme example?
Because like a conflict with just...
All right, Benz, you're 120 kilos, yeah?
Okay.
You could do damage to 99.9% of the population.
Yeah.
Who are you really scared of walking down the pavement? Like in this world that you painted, where you're having conflict and the threat of violence is an important part of that conflict. Who are you really scared of? Someone with a weapon, right? Maybe. that's not that common that you're gonna just see a weapon. When you're coming up against like most people, the threat of violence from them is not significant to you.
But it is.
But do you when you have conflict, do you genuinely feel that
factor
way?
that in?
Do you feel that way?
100%.
Or with normal people?
With normal people. Like 100% factor. It's actually factor in all the time. It's just that like, you have to understand that the situation that you might walk into is one where someone may be having a worse day than you. And if you understand that, it's that this fight may be bigger to them than it is to you. And if that fight is big, you might win this particular battle, but you may not win the next battle or the battle after that.
But Benz, I can't lie. I'm hearing you talk. You sound like you're going into a war zone. You don't have to engage in violence. It's just not that. It's not necessary to do.
Well, I'm just saying, if that was the case, that's like worst case scenario.
Right.
So we avoid those scenarios by avoiding conflict.
But it's because of the threat of violence.
It's not solely because of the threat of violence, but I believe that's a large part of it as to why pacifism isn't a viable approach for.
Well, let's
resolve conflict.
I said yes to the question, so I do think pacifism has a place in conflict resolution. Let's talk about why violence might be wrong, right? Like, the idea that you might do harm to someone, I think is morally, in isolation, morally unjustifiable. The act of doing harm to someone, so like if you don't hear your feel, that's mad. Like, you're basically coercing someone physically. You're getting them to do what you want them to do in a physical way, and you're doing harm to that person. Like, that's not morally justifiable to do harm to that person in that context.
I could morally justify it.
Let me hear it.
Well, essentially, if we're looking at what morally justifiable is, that's basically doing the right thing.
We'll come back to that.
Okay. But essentially, because we have to define what being moral is, because if you're being morally good, that would suggest that you're doing the correct thing. Like, whatever ideology or theory you have, you end up at doing the right thing.
Yeah, I would say more broadly that the net impact of your actions is positive.
So if somebody is behaving in a manner, like, say, your child keeps... Some people I work with, their children would be biting other children. And they'd be in the nursery and one will bite one. And they complain to the
What's
parents.
going on?
They'll complain to the parents. And then another one would bite another one. And it just happened to become in like a circle of... it started with who was the biter. We don't know who the biter is. Then they found out the biter, but the biter's changed by that point to another person. Anyway.
Right. All the kids are biting each other.
So one of the children of one of my colleagues, his son was a biter in the end. He started off as the victim.
Right.
And then he became the protagonist.
See how trauma goes down the chain.
Well, that's for another day. But yeah, so he started biting. And I'm just saying, okay, what if I just thump my child a little bit? I'm just saying, this is the scenario we're discussing. If he said, like, okay, you just give him one to say, like, stop biting kids.
Yeah.
Would that be fair?
Your colleague's a rugby player.
No, it's not that colleague. Not that colleague, no.
No, that would not be justifiable in any way. Putting your hands on kids is just wrong to me. And it's not only wrong because it's an act of violence, it's also wrong because that's a vulnerable person in your care. Do you know what I mean? There's already an imbalance of power because he's your child. He's a vulnerable person. He depends on you for so much, for shelter, food, all the things that parents give to kids. Right?
Yeah. Making a compelling case.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that even the kid's capacity to like defend himself from you is completely reduced. It's completely impaired. So you're hitting him, there's already an imbalance of power, and on top of that, you're basically abusing him on top. What you're describing is child abuse.
Sam, you want to make me die today.
I don't even know why we're laughing.
So you're saying, this
hitting your kid is child abuse.
He's been biting off this youth's hand, yeah?
Forget all that. Hitting your
Your
kid
child
is...
is bite. No. But what we're discussing is it ever morally justifiable?
Right, and I don't think the net impact of the action of hitting your kid can ever be good. There's no it's not positive, the net impact of what you're doing. Not only have you physically harmed
We just
them...
fundamentally disagree with that though.
Yeah, but let's think about the impact of hitting a kid.
Yeah.
Right? On some level, when you hit a kid, it's a bit unpredictable. You don't know how that child is going to internalize what you've done. You don't even know whether it's going to correct the behavior that you see is wrong with that kid.
Yeah.
So already we're going into a bit of a grey area.
Yeah, but that's the same as like telling him something. You don't understand how they're going to receive that information.
I appreciate that, but the negative impact of just talking to your child, there's no negative impact of just communicating with your child, telling them, right? There is definitely a negative impact of hitting someone.
Well, there isn't definitely a negative impact.
Okay.
There isn't a guaranteed negative impact. That's where the problem. That's where you're fundamentally wrong.
Oh my God. So when you hit someone, you've been hit before.
Yeah.
Right. When you're hit, what happens to you in that moment?
You talking about?
You incur physical damage, number one.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a negative impact, is it not? Come on, Benz, agree with me on this. When someone is hit, they incur physical damage. Is that not a negative?
No. I just don't think it is.
So is what, neutral or good? Because that's the three
feel
buckets that we've got, right?
Well,
we've got good, neutral, or bad.
It's dependent on the outcome, right?
The outcome is physical damage, and I'm saying physical damage
in and of itself.
We'll get to the other stuff.
Okay, I've said it's neutral.
You're tweaking. It's neutral if someone gets a bruise on their leg.
Yeah, that's not what we said.
No, hold up. But I'm saying physical damage. Yeah, so if you're cut, is that not negative?
No, but we're talking about say you slap them, right?
Yeah.
I thought you were referring to that as physical damage. Whether they haven't got bruised, they haven't been significantly harmed.
But you'd say on the whole that physical damage is bad.
Excessive physical damage is bad, yeah.
So a bruise, a cut, is that excessive? If I stub my toe and my toe's hurting, I've incurred physical damage. That's not good.
If you hit someone so they're bruised, is physical damage morally justifiable against a child? Of course not.
So if you hit a kid and the kid is bruised, that's not morally justifiable.
That's too far.
Okay, we can agree on that. Yeah. So where's the line to you? Is just a quick slap, a pinch?
Well, it's a very case-by-case basis.
Right, okay, so we've kind of covered the physical damage. Now let's move on to the psychological damage. When you hit someone and you exert your force over that kid, to me, you're incurring some kind of trauma in their mind. Bro, there's literally scientific studies that show that a child who is beaten or is taken physical damage from a family member takes that into their adulthood. You said that before.
Yeah.
Is it a factor of...
Taking it into your adulthood, how we define trauma in this day and age, since you want to be Gen Z so much, even though you're a millennial, how people have decided to define
You got
trauma.
me red-handed.
How people have decided to define trauma gives me cause for concern. Because what we discuss is any painful moment becomes trauma. And I don't believe that to be true.
I think when someone that you love, who is supposed to be taking care of you and bringing you up in this world, hurts you in a physical way, I think that's pretty significant psychological damage will be incurred in that moment.
Anecdotally, I say no. And anecdotally, can you say?
Anecdotally? What do you mean anecdotally?
Well, so personally.
I'd say, yeah, it did. I would incur damage.
Oh. Well, anyway, that's that segment. That's that segment. We'll leave that there.
Yeah.
On to segment B, which actually flows quite nicely, because does non-violence indicate moral strength?
I think it does. Especially in the type of conflicts we were talking about before. So trivial violence between people. The phrase taking a moral high ground is there for a reason, because the person who walks away from that conflict or chooses to disengage from the violent part of that conflict is displaying some level of moral strength there. You know what I mean? They're displaying a level of patience, or they can process the injury to their pride or their anger, and they can walk away from the situation. And I think that's pretty valiant to do that, don't you?
Yeah, my initial answer to the question was no. No, non-violence doesn't indicate moral strength. And it stayed at no. The way I broke this up was essentially the way we've defined moral is the right thing to do. And
The way you've defined.
the way I've defined moral is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do ideally equals the least amount of harm. I don't know if you can agree with this, but I'm going to explain my thought process to you.
I absolutely agree with the last thing you just said. I'm on board.
And then why do we behave morally, or why do we do the thing that is the least amount of harm? Because it's the right thing to do. But non-violence doesn't equate to right. Restraint may indicate moral strength, but just simply because you weren't violent, it now doesn't mean you're now morally stronger than another.
Right, so let's break it down a little bit. So in cases where you feel an urge to be violent, like let's say that scenario where someone just slaps me in the street, and it could be the end of it, we could just leave it at that, or I can engage them. I feel angry, like I want to slap them back, like the fuck, like he just slapped me. In that scenario, if you disengage and you walk away, is that admirable to you in a moral sense? Why?
I feel like you still have to confront the person.
Why do you need to confront them?
Because somebody has, to use your words, inflicted trauma on you, and you now have to deal with that trauma that they've inflicted.
Okay, but like, two wrongs don't make a right, and that second wrong is definitely not going to deal with your trauma.
Well, you have to understand why this was done, first of all, in order to, deal with the trauma, right? So
Listen, hold on. Nah, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do that. I'll let you get away with it once or twice, but the line stops here. Listen, what I'm saying is, if someone slaps you, for example, like the parent slapping the child, I firmly believe that will inflict trauma on the child. But the solution for that child is not to hit their parent back.
I'm not saying you have to hit him back. I just have to confront him.
Even confronting your parent, I don't think is gonna solve your trauma.
Oh, okay.
But going on to the other thing you said, like understanding why they did it, that's definitely gonna help.
Precisely, that's why you confront them, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just walking away.
Fair enough. I thought we were talking about the situation where someone slaps you in the street, you confront them straight away as soon as they've slapped you.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
But surely that's just gonna lead to like...
Well, you have to understand, like,
you're gonna scrap now?
No, because we're going with the premise that, like, we don't understand why this person has slapped me.
Yes.
So you must confront them to be like, why are you slapping me, bro? And it could be an accident, for all we know.
Could be.
Could have been on purpose, could have been something you did. That you're like, oh, fair. I probably deserve that. Do you know what I mean? So I can't see how you wouldn't confront them, how once they slap you, you just say, oh, sorry, and walk away.
The question is, does non-violence indicate moral strength, right? And in your scenario, you've not used violence in any way. You confronted them, you had a conversation, and you resolved it.
Yeah.
And I think that does indicate moral strength. What you did was non-violence.
No, but it's restraint. It's not so much non-violence. It's restraint, really.
But to me, non-violence is basically conflict resolution without violence. Isn't it?
Yeah, but like, if the scenario required me to still like be violent, then I would be violent.
And at that specific point, to me, it would become morally unjustifiable because you've engaged in violence. At that point, it wouldn't indicate moral strength to me.
So you think you become morally weaker?
The moment you lay hands on someone, for sure.
The moment violence is involved, you are morally weaker.
In the scenario that we're talking about, yeah, there's other scenarios that I'll get onto later that I think violence is actually admirable.
No, but with the question, so like, by definition, you're saying violence indicates moral weakness.
In this scenario, yes.
No. But like, if we say yes, does non-violence indicate moral strength? And I say no, it doesn't. And you say yes, it does. Surely, by definition, violence indicates moral weakness.
It does.
Yeah, see, I don't
I will also give you scenarios where I think the opposite is true. But I think in this interpersonal one-on-one like conflict, I do think violence equates to moral weakness, what you just said.
Okay.
In other scenarios where, for example, like you have the systemic oppression of a group, or you've got some sort of imbalance where there's someone that's vulnerable and is being taken advantage of, and literally violence is being done to that person already, in that case, like for example, if you just take Rosa Parks or Malcolm X or Fred Hampton, like one of these like activists who used violence as a means of revolution, basically, in America, or emancipation, that is, to me, moral strength. Because that, they're risking so much. They're risking like imprisonment, violence against them, in most cases death. Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, basically murdered in cold blood. It takes so much to like stand up in the face of that oppression that I think it indicates moral strength. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, completely. So you don't truly believe that like non-violence? So you don't believe that it does?
I think in the case that we had before, where it's just one-on-one, like individuals, it is moral weakness. But in the case of like people standing up against systemic oppression from a state or like a massive group of people, that in that scenario is completely different to me. Because like systemic violence is being done upon them. There's literally no other means by which they can emancipate themselves. So they have to engage in violence, and they risk so much. There's so much self-sacrifice that I think in that moment, like to me, that is moral strength. So just to compare the two scenarios, like Malcolm X couldn't really just like get up and move to another part of America or like move to another part of his city where they weren't racist. Do you know what I mean? He'd have to basically like flee the Western world. There's no option there where he can like take the moral high ground and walk away. Like there's no way to do that. And obviously the civil rights movement, that movement had tried all types of non-violent methods.
But surely like someone could find a way to say, this is the time that we live in. This is your existence, this is your reality. Can you find a way to exist in this reality?
But that's not, we don't want that. Like, what, in America at that time?
Well, yeah, essentially, like, because you're saying he couldn't move away. Are you saying he couldn't coexist during that time? In a way that, I'm not arguing this, you know what I mean?
That's fine.
This is not I'm playing devil's advocate somewhat. That essentially he couldn't behave in a way he didn't need to use violence, for example.
Absolutely, that's what white people told him. You know what I mean? That's why...
And then would you argue that was morally just if he didn't do that? If he did that?
Well, I think both of those are like almost at that point is two sides of the same coin, because the goal in that emancipation movement is to basically free yourself from the systemic oppression.
So any action would be deemed as moral strength.
Yeah, absolutely. Because non-violence, for example, Martin Luther King was a massive proponent of non-violence. You know, protest, speak your piece, but don't go out and cause harm to other people. That him and like Malcolm X and Fred Hampton, they're kind of fighting the same fight. They're trying to get to the same end goal. They've just got different methods. So in that case, non-violence and violence are basically two sides of the same coin. Whereas in the individual scenario, the individual conflict that we talked about before, I think is a bit different. I think non-violence is morally just in a way that violence isn't.
So like what I'm taking from what you said is basically, if the problem is large enough, any action would be indicative of moral strength towards that problem.
Yeah, and also it's like, have you exhausted all of the ways of resolving this? Like in the scenario where two people are having a conflict on the street, walking away is an option. Like you can actually just walk away from that. I might not walk away from, like it's tough to walk away from in the heat of the moment, but Malcolm X and Fred Hampton couldn't walk away from that because their entire lives, their communities, their families are being oppressed in America. And in order to escape that, they'd have to move to some place somewhere else. It's just not an option for them to do.
Shift to the slap in the face scenario, right? Yeah. And someone slaps someone in the face, but that harm that they're causing to the person that they've slapped in the face, what if they're now struggling with that?
So,
do you understand what I mean?
Someone slapped me.
Oh, because basically, because if we're going from the premise that like moral is something that equates to the least amount of harm, Right now, that one person is just holding that pain. What if they're able to get rid of that pain?
I think but doing violence on someone else or back to the person who did it to you, I don't think it gets rid of that pain.
I'm not saying violence does, but confrontation, for example, conflict and potentially violence.
Yeah, I think you can have a confrontation with someone, especially that scenario that you painted before. To me, that's a dream scenario. Someone slaps you in the face and you've got the mental fortitude and restraint to not just go and bang them back, but now have an adult conversation. Like, that's a perfect scenario. Do you know what I mean? A well-adjusted adult would do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that's what we want, right?
Yeah.
So that's the scenario that I want, basically. That's 10-10.
All right. On to the most excitable segment on YouTube. The happiest, the most fun, the one that people have said they've enjoyed the most. I say I came up with it. So we've got the bullying dilemma. Your child is being bullied at school, and despite your efforts to address the issue with the school and the bully's parents, no effective action has been taken to stop the bullying. Your child is obviously unhappy. Do you continue down the road of speaking with the parents and the school to resolve the issue, which will likely conclude in 3 to 4 weeks? Or do you teach your child how to confront the bully, beat up the bully, and risk your child beginning to use conflict as a means of resolution?
Even when you said that, did your heart not stir a little bit when you said beat up the bully? In your heart, does that feel like the right thing to do? It can't be the right thing to do. There's no way that I'm teaching my kid to go and beat up another kid in the playground. That's impossible. That's impossible. And I know what you're gonna say. I know what you're gonna retort with. What are you doing? What are you doing? Are you training your kid?
Well, you know.
That's a yes.
Some people raise men, some people raise mice.
Oh my God.
Mice.
I can't lie, I wanna know where you got that quote from, because it's trash.
Well, I've just made it up.
No, man.
But I struggle to see how my child could be struggling.
Very real, like, peak scenario, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
if your kid's struggling in school like that.
And I say, after exhausting all the other options, as we sort of discussed about in the previous segment, and I tell him not to confront this bully. I just don't know how I can do that.
Well, you say exhaust the other options. I don't personally think you've exhausted all options at that point. I don't think the only two options at that point are fight or do nothing.
What do you think the options are?
Well, clearly your kid's at a shit school. The school's trash. You've talked to the head teacher, you've talked to the teachers. They presumably can see what's happening on the playground, right?
Yeah.
Like, they can see that your kids are being bullied and they're not taking the correct steps to fix that. So it sounds to me like you need to take your kid out of that school. He needs to go to a better school.
You think that's the solution to that?
That's definitely a solution that I would come to before training my kid to beat up another kid.
It's sort of, we can say training, or it's somewhat of defense.
Self-defense.
Self-defense, really.
I don't even have a problem with self-defense. I think self-defense is a justifiable reason for using violence. But in this particular scenario, it feels like we're teaching the kid to specifically use it against a bully.
No, the scenario, you teach the kid to beat up the bully, right? That's what it says. It teaches the kid to beat up the bully. And it's not so much that he will now go and locate the bully, find him and bang him in the face. It's the matter if this bully comes to trouble him or her, they are able to go back at the bully.
Yeah, and
Physically. And feel, not even so much go back at them, because they might still get moved to, but they have the confidence to do that.
I don't think that's a bad thing to want your kid to have. The confidence that I could defend myself if something peak happens at school. And that's something that I imagine will be useful for him going into adulthood, adolescence, whatever that might be. But it's just a scenario of we're teaching self-defense in light of him being bullied. in the knowledge that probably the person I'm going to use this on is this bully, where I think it's more valuable for the child not to teach him that violence is the way you're going to resolve this conflict, but for example, like you were talking about before, trying to understand, for example, why is this kid bullying me? Do you know what I mean? I think that's a fair conversation to have with your child.
No, I don't. I don't.
Are you sure?
I just don't think it's my child's problem. I've
Yes.
spoken to your parents. I've spoken to the school. My concern isn't the other child. My concern is my child.
Right, but what I'm saying is the bullying is going to have an effect on your kid that you don't want. We don't want our kids to be bullied because that's going to impact them in numerous ways, right? It will impact their confidence, number one. It will impact them psychologically, and it will change the way they interact with other kids in that school, and that's just overall bad. I'm saying we can start to reduce that negative impact by talking to our kid and saying the reason this kid is bullying you is because of X, Y, and Z, and it's usually because that kid is going through some shit. That kid himself is traumatized.
Yeah.
Right? That's usually what schoolyard bullies are about. Like,
he's struggling from something.
He's struggling from home, like he can't, he's fighting with his schoolwork, like something's happening to that kid. And don't you think it would be useful for our kid to understand that about the bully?
Yeah, I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah, it would be beneficial, right?
Yeah, but it's not my concern.
But this is your concern, this is your child.
Yeah, but that's not my, well, okay.
You know what I'm saying?
It's not my major concern.
Your major concern is you want the bullying to stop.
Precisely.
I just think taking him out of that school, because it's clearly not a good school. You agree that, like, the things you described, you're describing a bad school, right? Like, a good school wouldn't allow that to happen.
Let me not lie, like, I don't have children.
Right.
So I don't know how these situations may be resolved. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be speculating to say, yeah, this is a bad school because this happened, but it may be more common than we think. Do you understand? So the idea of the scenario is not particularly to go into the intricacies of like school and policy and how it's just to understand how you would deal with a particular scenario.
Yeah, and the only reason I guess I went down that route is because I'm trying to find ways that might resolve this conflict that don't involve violence. Like I'm trying to find, is there an alternative here? And one of the alternatives to me that's pretty, it just stands out. I can't help but I can't get away from it. This is a bad school, let's move schools.
You know what I think this? Because this actually bleeds into like a few other topics.
Right.
Because I feel like it bleeds into sort of courage and it bleeds into the ideas of surrounding identity and perception. And when it bleeds into those ideas, it affects your decision-making regarding your child. So it's not so much whether violence is wrong or right in that particular scenario. It's sort of like, if I choose this option where I move school, I believe that can have a negative impact on your child.
Because what, you're teaching your child to run away from problems or something?
Essentially. I just feel that can have an issue with your identity.
But I think it might teach your kid that if you don't explain nothing to your kid. Because like his child brain will be like, oh, problem, we move from problem, run away. Like he might do that arithmetic in his head. But if you sit him down and talk to him and be like, this is my decision making. My decision making went X, Y, Z, A, B, C. This kid did this to you because clearly he's hurt here, there, wherever it might be. And you tell your kid, when I went to the school, they didn't deal with it. Do you know what I mean? And I don't know how old your kid is, but your kid can understand, if you dumb it down to him enough, I had this thought process, I think the school's bad, and I think it's best for your future that I take you to another school. And if you instill that rationale in your child, it will replace the we ran away from the problem rationale.
Basically, there's two ways you can deal with it. Like, okay, non-violent, violent. And if we look at both of these options, there are like possible negative impacts to each choice.
Okay.
And it's a matter of you deciding which one's more negative. Which one is worse?
So what's the negative impact of moving school?
What I've explained.
Right.
How...
But could you not mitigate it the way I would mitigate it?
Of course.
Yeah.
You could mitigate it, but that could still happen, right?
Yeah.
And what's the negative scenario to teaching your son to beat up a bully, defend himself against the bully, etc., is that now he thinks violence is a
It's a way to resolve
feasible
conflict.
route to resolve conflict, right? So you have those two. And
To me, that one on the left there,
that one on the left's worse.
that's catastrophic. That is so bad. Think about how that will impact his relationships. The people we look at like now, in adulthood, they commit domestic abuse. The chain started in childhood like that.
But it's the same.
I'm not saying, look,
no. But what I'm saying is, you get people who are emotionally avoidant. Because when they've had a problem,
Yeah.
they've left the problem. They've decided that this problem is too much for them and they want to remove themselves from it. So I just think there are problems that come from it. It's just which problem you're willing to have or potentially have. You might not have either of them. And ideally, if you mitigate it enough, you don't have either of them.
How would you mitigate your one? How would you mitigate the potential that your child sees violence as a viable route to conflict resolution?
You explain to them that this is your last resort. We have exhausted every possible option.
Right.
The only way we can now do this is for this scenario.
That's fair. I appreciate that. I just think that statement isn't true. I don't think you've exhausted all options.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
Whether it's true or not, but that's what you told your child.
Yeah.
You lied to him, did you? You lied to him or her. He said, we tried everything, mate. We tried everything, geez, mate.
No, bang it.
Sorry, son. We tried everything, mate. You're going to have to thump him up.
Is that what your colleague said?
All right. Thank you for joining us. Myself, Benno Abano, Samuel Tefra.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope you really enjoyed pacifism and how you deal with violence. We don't particularly condone violence. Violence is last resort. And it's something that has caused so much pain for so many people.
Absolutely.
And when we discuss these things theoretically, and we understand that there's scenarios that no one wants to be in, but they're decisions and choices that we might have to make someday, and we want to understand why and how and the potential pitfalls of each decision. And that's what we find interesting to discuss. So, well, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Much love. All right, let's get cracking. What it do, baby? That was a good one, didn't it?
That was good. Yeah, boy.